what I'll actually ask you first is a quick show of hands from all of you. How many of you are or consider yourself to be Earth scientists? Okay. And how many of you think you know something about geothermal? Not a lot, but something about geothermal. Okay. That's 50-50. I'm sort of going to assume that you don't know too much about either. So some of you, please bear with me if I go hit things which you think, well, I already know that. Equally, for some of you who don't, so it's a fairly small room this. If I say something which you really think, I really don't understand what you mean there, put your hand up and just ask. We'll have questions at the end, but if there's something which you suddenly think, I didn't get that, just put your hand up and we'll stop. What I'm going to do is just give a bit of background about geothermal, particularly in the UK context, as opposed to the world context. Then look at some of the drivers for why we should be thinking about UK geothermal, and then look at some of our resources split up into these three areas of deep saline aquifers, the EGS, the engineered geothermal systems, and what I've called here fractured rock, and we'll talk a bit more about that. And then I'm just going to finish off with a little bit on mine waters, which is, you may have heard something about, there's been quite a lot of talk over the last few years, but so far not a lot of action, so we'll have a little discussion on that as well. Let's start at the very beginning. What is geothermal? There's a very simple definition there that says that geothermal energy is the energy stored in the form of heat beneath the Earth's surface. Well, that encompasses an awful lot, clearly. Extremely simple. And the classic geothermal, of course, is this sort of situation here. This is actually northern Italy, an area called Lardarello, where if you drill a borehole, you don't have to go very deep, probably less than 2 kilometres, you will get an enormous amount of steam. And that isn't just leaking out of the ground. Where I was stood taking that picture, the noise from that was so loud you couldn't speak to the person next to you. You know, it is really, really powerful. And of course, the Earth is hot. This is an example of evidence for that heat. And the heat within the Earth actually has sort of two original sources. The primordial heat of planetary accretion is still there. The Earth is actually still cooling down. Despite the work of people like Jeffreys back in the 19th century who concluded that the Earth should have cooled down millennia ago, is actually quite insulating the Earth, and so there's still a lot of that primordial heat. But that's not the only part of the question. The other part is the radioactive decay of the elements of thorium, uranium, and potassium. Very slow decay, giving out enough heat to maintain these temperatures. You know, and temperatures down here, sort of at the core mantle boundary, you know, we're up to 4,000 degrees centigrade. Evidence, of course, by the molten outer core. And of course, where these very deep resources come to the surface is at the edge of the tectonic plates, particularly on the subduction zones. Not surprisingly, therefore, the geothermal development of what we might call the high enthalpy, the classic geothermal, is around the plate margins. So on the western coast of the US, the Philippines, New Zealand, these are all some of the big players in power, high enthalpy geothermal. More players coming on the scene: Indonesia, Mexico. UK, of course, is over here. We're in what we might call an intraplate region, stuck between the mid-Atlantic ridge out here in the Atlantic. And there we also have Iceland with all their deep geothermal. And down here, where we had the collision of Africa up against Europe, with still some residual activity going on there, as evidenced in Italy, and out through Greece and into Turkey. So, what can we say about the UK? How can we develop geothermal when clearly we're sat in an intraplate location well away from these plate margins? And what we really fall down to is two primary opportunities. The first occurs where we can have, at depth, a sufficient increase in temperature that it becomes worth us trying to exploit. And the classic for this is in fact these radiothermal elements again, our uranium, thorium, potassium. Because in some rocks, particularly some granitic rocks, these occur in a higher concentration such that the heat produced will create a temperature anomaly. Having said that, we have to go quite deep. We are looking 4 to 5 kilometres to go down into this rock. And granite is classically not a permeable rock. That is, water doesn't flow through it. So we can't just, as we saw in that Italian example, drill and the steam will come out. We can drill and we can get some hot temperatures. What we then have to do is to engineer the reservoir. And so that means, in the ideal situation, hitting some fractures and then engineering those fractures, probably through fracking techniques, to enhance the fracture network such that we develop a reservoir of fractured rock, and then we can introduce cold water, it flows through our fractured rock, and we can then return it as heated water up to the surface. Having said that, it's probably not going to be hot enough to drive a steam turbine, as again that classic Italian example, so we have to go through a binary fluid from which we can then run a turbine. So one of these systems is not going to be particularly large in terms of its output. We might get a few megawatts per geothermal system, but it's base load power. And so that is one of the big trumpeting calls for people trying to develop these sorts of projects in the UK, as opposed to obviously solar and wind and wave, is that this stuff is there all the time. And if we could develop enough of these, even though each one might only be a few megawatts, we might end up perhaps with a whole series of these power stations, perhaps up to 100 megawatts. So there is some potential there. Now our other opportunity is heat. Perhaps heat is a bigger opportunity for the simple reason, if you go deep enough, you'll find heat everywhere. Whereas in the power situation, you only get those heat anomalies to the granites in certain areas, as we'll see in a bit. So in this case, what we now need is our porous rocks, that's rocks with a large amount of void space, which is connected, so these rocks are permeable, and it's at sufficient depth that we get the temperature that we need for whatever our application is, whether that's district heating or agriculture or balinology, whatever it happens to be. So that depth could vary from perhaps a few hundred metres, if you just want to do it for greenhouses, to probably several kilometres if we want district heating. So the key here, because we're going to talk about this quite a lot, is we need porous rocks which are connected so they're permeable and at sufficient depth that we get that temperature that we need. And the way that we actually do this is that we would sink probably at least 2 boreholes. So we'd extract the water from one borehole, and then once it's been through our heat exchangers, we put that cooler water back in, far enough away from the first borehole so they don't interfere. But we have to do that partly for environmental reasons and partly to get the pressure up within the reservoir. Otherwise the water level will ultimately drop within our production borehole. So what I want to do now is just to look at the situation in the UK. Okay, we've seen those 2 potential applications. EGS for power, hot sedimentary aquifers for heat. So let's look at our continental neighbours. I'm going to start with mainland France. Okay, so this is not the Caribbean islands where they do have high enthalpy geothermal. This is just the country opposite on the other side of the channel. They don't have much electricity. At the moment, this is probably 0 now. This is at the end of 2012. They have one plant at a place called Source in the Rhine-Graben, which is a 3-well system into one of those granites. It's not working great, which is why it only came out with 1 megawatt. But that's partly because it was a research site. It was the European research site for nearly 20 years. And so a lot of research was done there, a lot of advance of knowledge, and then it was finally handed over to the power sector, who are now running it and getting about 1 megawatt. But what they have done in France is this direct use. In other words, going into those hot sedimentary aquifers, particularly around Paris, the Paris basin, and they're up to 345 megawatts of installed power. What I've also got on here, and I'm only putting this in for information, this is not a talk about ground source heat, but I want to show you just so we can compare the UK. In France, at the end of 2012, there was up to about 2 gigawatts of installed ground source heat in something like 162,000 installations. So this is the situation in Germany. Germany's doing better with the power. They've got several of these EGS installed power stations in the Rhine-Graben, and they also managed to get one into one of these sedimentary aquifers near Munich. So they're up to about 12 installed megawatt installed capacity, and they put nearly 5 new megawatts in 2012. Direct use, they're a bit behind France at the moment, but they're catching up. 28 megawatts were installed in 2012, and they're up to about 200 megawatts. Ground source heat, well, they're soaring ahead with the ground source heat. They're up to 3 gigawatts, or 3.5 gigawatts of installed in something like 265,000 installations. So don't forget, both mainland France and Germany, their geology is not particularly different to ours. Certainly not when we're talking geothermal. So let's see the situation in the UK. So this is where we were at the end of 2012. 0 installed megawatts of electricity, a piddling 2.6 megawatts of installed direct use, and that's been there for 25 years in one plant. Nothing installed in 2012, not surprisingly. And our ground source heat, again, we're way behind. We have something like only 355 megawatts installed in something like 17,000 installations. And these things are going in at about the rate of about 2,500 a year in the UK, and that was compared to about 25,000 a year in Germany. So there's a big question here, isn't there? Why is it that we're so far behind continental Europe when their geology is pretty much the same, the cost of energy is the same? So what's going on? Why are we so far behind? There's a number of reasons. There's probably no simple one reason, but there is history, and part of the history is, of course, the North Sea, particularly the oil and gas from the North Sea. This green line here is oil price from the 1960s onwards. And what you see here is that for nearly 20 years, the oil price was about $20 a barrel. And that was reflected, of course, through to the gas price. We had security supply, we had cheap gas. So what did we do? We went for gas, not surprisingly. So we have gas-powered power stations. Everybody has a gas boiler in their house. And that's what we were encouraged to do. The government spent huge amounts putting in gas grids. So all the major cities, all the major towns are on gas. Abroad, particularly in France and Germany, they didn't have security supply. They still had the same prices, but they had to buy it. They had to buy it from abroad. And so they put more effort into looking for alternatives. And we're paying the price now. But we're also, it's come back to haunt us, because we are now, and for gas, since about 2004, we're now a net importer. And that is going to continue, quite clearly. So what was once a nice, secure situation, big production from the North Sea, has now gone. The landscape has changed. And so what we've now got is some drivers for geothermal. And these drivers, I'm sure you're all familiar with these sorts of things, the government's attempts to move towards a low carbon. And we have a whole series of policy documents. The UK Renewable Energy Strategy came out in, I think, 2009. And there was a roadmap in there of where we're supposed to be going, which included geothermal in one paragraph. But the geothermal energy has some advantages. It pretty much produces no greenhouse gases, not the sort of stuff we're talking about in the UK. Abroad it might do. You do get some CO2 in some of those very high enthalpy wells. It can contribute both from heat and power towards our goals, our 2020 goals of 50% of energy from renewables. Can, of course, secure supply. It's always going to be homegrown. As I mentioned, that electricity is base load, so it has some advantages. And the government, in following through these documents, is now looking at these incentives and obligations. So we have, I hope you're familiar with this, the renewable heat incentive, the feed-in tariff for heat, for all renewable technology heat. It's taken the government a long time to get their act together, because only from this April did they bring in a domestic tariff for ground source heat. And also from this April, the same announcement, they finally brought in a tariff for deep geothermal. So it's 5 pence per kilowatt hour for any heat that comes from greater than 500 metres depth. So it's taken a long time for us to finally get to that point, when you think that France and Germany were offering these sorts of incentives over 10 years ago. Electricity market reform, again, I hope you're familiar with this a little bit, this contracts for difference, where we have these strike prices for all the different renewable technologies. So if the price of the electricity is below the strike price, then you get a subsidy up to that level. Should the market price ever go above that strike price, then the generators have to pay some money back. But what it gives you is certainty, and you can plan for the future within your renewable technology. And so, again, earlier this year, about the very end of last year, last December, wasn't it? A year ago, this price of £145 per megawatt hour was declared for geothermal, even though we don't yet have any. There's the price. It's about the same as offshore wind, I think, but it's way behind some of the other renewables. So wave, and I think tidal, get something like £300 per megawatt hour. So there is an incentive there. The question is it going to be big enough? But within that, we also have planning policy statements. Again, these apply for renewables in general, but regions are expected to set these renewable targets in line with national targets. And we have this thing called the Merton Rule, which started off obviously in the borough of Merton in London, which is spread, which asks for 10% of energy needs from on-site renewable energy. And clearly geothermal can contribute to that if you're in the right place. Okay, so we've looked at some of the background. We've seen some of the drivers for change. We've seen that we're not doing that great compared to our continental cousins. So let's now look at the UK and see what are the opportunities specifically. So what we need to start off with is the temperatures. This here is the heat flow map. And it's obviously the flow of heat, the heat flux, which is coming straight up. We assume it's vertical. And this is a very rough map of that. What we see are some hotspots. We have a hotspot down here and here and here. And in fact, these correspond to some of those granites. Everywhere else it looks a bit so-so. And just to put it in context of the sort of heat, I'm sure if you put your hand on the ground, you notice it's not particularly hot. It's about 3 orders of magnitude less than the solar insolation. These are the sort of quantities we're talking about when we talk about the UK heat flux. And it does vary though. And what it does is it creates the temperature increase with depth because of the heat flow, and we have an average value for the UK of about 26 degrees per kilometre as you go down. So if we assume for many regions, if you have an average annual air temperature of about 10 degrees, if you go down a kilometre, you might expect to find a temperature of about 36, 37 degrees. But it does vary, and it varies for these reasons here. I just mentioned these heat-producing elements, which are concentrated in certain areas. Thermal conductivity of the rocks is also very important. Rocks with a low thermal conductivity, quite a lot of mudstones, they will be like a bit like a blanket. So they'll create an insulating layer, so you'll get the temperatures higher underneath. In areas where you have these high thermal conductivity rocks, it's going to be lower. So that can vary as you go down the column. And groundwater flow, particularly in the near surface, obviously groundwater can transport heat with it. That's what we call a phenomenon called advection, and that can have quite significant impact on the temperatures you may find in certain areas. Thickness of the crust does come into it. We don't know that much about the thickness of the crust across the onshore UK. It's not going to vary greatly, but even though we don't have any data up here, we think that the crust might thin up here. The reason it doesn't show on there is because there is no data, basically, in Scotland or Wales. It's actually a very poor map. So let's look at these temperatures. This is an attempt to look at real temperatures in the ground. So, because there's no data really in Scotland or Wales or Eastern England, then just ignore all these areas. All these contours are irrelevant. But what we do see is that the temperatures do vary. And even down at 500 metres, we've got temperatures here up above 30 degrees. And if we go right down to a kilometre, then we've now got what appear to be a few hotspots. And some of these temperatures, and then you can see the contours, that's 46 I think, so some of these temperatures are probably at about 50 degrees in places. So that's well above our average geothermal gradient. We might expect 36 degrees at a kilometre depth. So that's something to bear into mind when we start to think about what can we exploit. Obviously we want to exploit where the temperatures are highest. So this looks like quite a busy slide. And what it's trying to say is those deep saline aquifers where we want to get those porous, permeable rocks at depth so that we can just simply pump the hot water out. The best place we're going to find that is in what these rocks we call collectively the Permo-Triassic sandstones. So this comes from a period of geological time, the Permo-Trias, which has created these sedimentary basins. And these rocks, even though they're over 100 million years old, they haven't been compressed in the way that some rocks have. So they have maintained quite a lot of that porosity and that permeability within the sandstones at depth. And so we have essentially, if we look over here, this is what we call the Eastern England Basin. Then we have the Cheshire Basin, the Worcester Basin here, and the Wessex Basin down in the south. And in Northern Ireland, although we know less about these, we have 3 smaller basins, the Loughney, the Larne, and the sometimes called the Rathlin Basin, the Rathlin Trough. We know less about those because they're covered with weird lavas. We know quite a lot about these. This is actually a depth map over here of these Permo-Triassic rocks. So in the Eastern England Basin, they're probably only going back down to perhaps 1 to 2 kilometres, perhaps 2 kilometres at the coast into the southern North Sea. But this the Cheshire Basin, these rocks are getting pretty deep. You know, we're down now to over 4 kilometres depth. Worcester again, we're probably 3.5, and Wessex in places it does indeed go down to 3 kilometres as well. So these rocks are getting pretty deep, certainly greater than 1,500 metres. And once you get below those sorts of depths, we're starting to get the sort of temperatures where we can start to exploit the hot water for all sorts of applications. And because those rocks are going to be porous and permeable, there's a pretty fair chance we're going to get a producing borehole if we put one in. It's not guaranteed because rocks are complicated, but there's a reasonable chance, and it's what you might call our best bet. And so if we quantify some of these numbers, this is an attempt to look at the heat in place of one of those sets of rocks, at what we call the Sherwood sandstone. This is the slightly shallower one of the two, but there's more of it. And we come up with these very ridiculously unwieldy numbers, or something like 200 times 10 to the 18 to 328 joules. Now this is the heating place in the rocks. It includes the matrix of the rocks, all the pore space, all the water, and so on. Clearly you could only ever get a small fraction of that. But if we were to really stick down lots and lots of boreholes, we might be able to get perhaps 20% of that out, if we fully explored those possibilities. Now that's a lot of heat. 20% of that is a lot. So potentially there is a big resource, a big heat resource within these areas. So the question is, and we'll talk about this, how can we actually get into that and use it? Well, we mentioned back on that slide about UK usage, there was one scheme, and this is it. The one scheme is at Southampton. And it only ended up being put in because it was on the back of a thing called the Geothermal Energy Exploration Programme, funded by the government back in the 1980s. An exploration borehole was drilled at Southampton, and the City Council, in collaboration with a company called Cofley, had the foresight to say, well, we've got a borehole, let's try and use it. And so they created the Southampton company, and they pump brine from about 1,800 metres. It starts off at 76 degrees centigrade, and they discharge after their heat exchange at about 8 degrees. But what they do, and why they didn't have to sink another borehole, is they actually discharge that to the sea. You probably won't be allowed to do that now, because what it does is, as I mentioned right at the beginning, it lets the pressure drop within the reservoir, and that has happened to this project. And it's not actually working at the moment because the water level in their well has dropped, because they haven't kept the pressure up. But nevertheless, it's worked for something like 25 years, very successfully, contributing about 18% of the energy to the district heating scheme in Southampton, which is mainly now a gas-fired scheme. But nevertheless, 18% for 25 years, or essentially free energy, is pretty good. And that proves it can be done. Okay, if they can do it at Southampton, which is right on the edge of the Wessex Basin, then we can do it somewhere else. So this is a Cheshire Basin, just to show you. The Cheshire Basin is probably, you saw on that other map it was a big red, it's probably one of our best prospect. So this is just showing you the depth and the temperature within these two Permo-Triassic rocks, a Sherwood sandstone, that's a Triassic rock, and this is the Permian sands. These Permian sands go down, in fact, to nearly 5 kilometres, you can see here. So we would expect to get temperatures probably over 100 degrees. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good resource in what is almost certainly a good permeable rock, and there's lots of it. And we know quite a lot about it, as you can see from that diagram. And so there is a scheme currently being proposed by Cheshire East Council beneath Crewe, which sits right on top of that red dot, to actually get on with it and exploit it. So I'm hopeful that we will see something within the next year or two from Crewe exploiting what has to be our best resource. Because if you can't exploit it at Crewe, then I'm not sure there's much hope for the rest of the UK. And in fact, it's almost a question of why on earth hasn't it been done at Crewe, when it's been done at Southampton, it's been done in Paris, and it's been done in Munich. Why has it taken so long for us to get around to this? Well, let's hope for the best. So I'm just going to quickly go back a little bit to the EGS. Okay, this is the power production. Where might the best places for this be? Now, from the heat flow map, we've already sort of identified our 3 areas. This map here shows a distribution of granite, where we know it at the moment, throughout the UK crust. Now, not all granites are hot. So on here, what we try to show is, with the arrows and the boxes, these are granites where surface exposures have been measured, and the geochemistry indicates that we're going to get a heat production greater than 3.5 microwatts per meters cubed. Okay, that doesn't sound much. But only in these ones, this is Cornwall, what we call the Northern England granites, and the Eastern Highlands of Scotland, are the only places really where we find these heat production values high enough that you can then get a temperature anomaly, or potentially get a temperature anomaly at depth, or we might then consider doing an EGS type project. So we can come up with numbers for that as well. This is probably less constrained than the previous estimate. I think basically what we're trying to find is the temperatures, because ultimately it's how you're then going to engineer that into some sort of a reservoir. Without question, the best prospect for this has to be Cornwall. We've actually revised some of these heat flows recently. These are the heat flows in these boxes. We've revised these upwards by looking at what's called the paleoclimate correction. In other words, past climate has affected the temperatures in the ground, so you have to allow for it when you're doing very accurate heat flow measurements. And in fact, we think we can revise these things up, and it leads to a revision up of the temperatures you might expect, probably to over 200 degrees at 5 kilometres depth. Now that's quite reasonable for EGS. Okay, taking that water out, going through a binary exchanger, so that we're actually using a binary electricity production. these are quite reasonable temperatures, certainly as good as getting in Germany, where we've seen they got already some like 12 megawatts of installed capacity. And there are two companies pursuing this. There's one called EDS Energy, based at the Eden project, which is here on the St Austell granite. Another called Geothermal Engineering Limited, who are trying to develop something here on the Common Ellis granite. Now, having said that, these companies were hoping to get the government to throw some money in to put down what they consider to be the initial borehole. There's been a lot of problems of trying to get private sector finance to go for these projects in the UK. And the view from many people in the industry is that what you need to do is simply to build the confidence that you're going to find what we said is down there. So they've been trying to encourage government to put the money forward for the first borehole. And so governments have been sort of dithering as they always do, and last year they got Atkins to do a report specifically on power. Can we generate power from geothermal energy in the UK? That was their remit. And basically they ended up by saying that the perceived project development risk profile was just too great in the UK to attract this sort of investment. Again, they came up with some other recommendations. Maybe there should be a government-sponsored research fund. Maybe there should be a full-powered government-backed demonstrator. However, the government in response to that said, no way we're going to commit large capital sums for doing geothermal electricity. Their response was to say, well, we've raised the tariff for electricity and we've raised the tariff for the renewable heat, because you also get heat, of course, out of an EGS system as well. So we've done enough. That was the government's view. So I have to say, really, that EGS is still on hold. We're still in that limbo of trying to get the finance together to put down the first well. Having said that, I was at the meeting only on Tuesday, where everyone was talking and seemed quite buoyant that something was going to happen soon from public money, but not from UK government money, but in fact from EU money. So let's wait and see what happens. So, going back to heat now, going back to our deep saline aquifers, this is the, I hope you're all familiar with this, is the heat demand map from DEC, so showing where people use heat. Not surprisingly, it's centred on all the major cities, including Leeds. What I want to show is that basically where we've got these deep saline aquifers with the heat don't really correspond very well with our main heat demand centres. And that actually is one of the reasons why it's taking so long to get things going. Because in France, one of these nice sedimentary aquifers where they've got the supply sits underneath Paris. So it's a no-brainer that you're going to go for it. Unfortunately, our cities don't sit on it. So that is actually one of the barriers for things taking so long to get off the ground. However, all is not necessarily lost. So if I'm not sitting on a deep saline aquifer, then there are some other possibilities. Now the older rocks, that's older than our permatrias rocks, tend to be less porous and less permeable. So it's a bit hit and miss. If you drill a borehole into them as well, you'll get any water out. You might, but very often you won't. The risk profile is even higher than the other sediments. However, we do know that lots of our rocks are fractured. Ancient fractures go throughout the crust. And we have evidence of hot water coming up by the little spa, the hot springs that we do have, at Bath in particular, a little bit in the Peak District. This system goes into South Wales, does indeed produce some quite warm water. At Bath Bristol, we can get 46 degrees centigrade coming out from what's known as the King's Spa. That implies that water must have gone quite deep. To be heated up to 46, it's probably coming up from something like 2.5 kilometres. So what that's telling us is that there are continuous fractures which are going quite deep. So one of the questions is, can we exploit these deep fractures elsewhere? Maybe beneath some of our major cities. An attempt was made to have a look at this in 2011 in Newcastle. Because Newcastle does not sit on one of our nice permatriassic sedimentary aquifers, but it does sit on these older carboniferous rocks. And a site came free in Newcastle. It was the old Scottish Newcastle Brewery, became free as a brownfield development site. So it's going to be a mix of university, office, urban living. So a prime opportunity to put in some renewable heating. And so a borehole was sunk there because of the demand, on the hope that they might be able to intersect either fractures or perhaps a porous, permeable, old carboniferous rock. And so the reservoir they're aiming for was this carboniferous fell sandstone, in the hope that it would connect into these fracture systems, which are known, which come in quite near Newcastle, And there's evidence that hot water has travelled along these fractures from, this is one of our high heat producing granites, the Weardale granite. There's evidence within the coal mines around Newcastle that hot water has indeed at some point percolated through the system. So the borehole was sunk on the hope of intersecting a combination of the fractures and this Carboniferous fell sandstone with hot water which may have moved from west to east. Now the result of that was that the borehole was successfully drilled after a couple of years, down to 1800 metres. It did indeed hit this Carboniferous fell sandstone formation in a good interval, down to nearly 1800 metres. A good temperature, 73 degrees centigrade, which implies therefore that we've got a higher than average gradient, 36 rather than 26 degrees per kilometre. Evidence therefore from these higher temperatures that idea of these warmer waters migrating west to east probably has happened. However, when that reservoir was what we call pump test to see if we get water out of it, it gave virtually nothing. It was as tight as you like. So there's a lesson here which says that the risk profile for this type of scheme is potentially quite high. And it also says that we should be trying to reduce that risk by doing as much exploration beforehand to try and make sure that we hit what we think we're going to hit. Because this is what puts the government off when we get these sorts of things which don't quite work out the way we wanted. Now all's not lost at this site. They're probably going to put in what's called a single borehole heat exchanger, a bit like a closed loop, very big closed loop ground source heat pump. And it will probably produce perhaps 400 kilowatts if they're lucky, but that's quite a lot less than what they were hoping for. So what we need in these sorts of situations is success. So I'm now just going to finish off by talking a little bit about coal mines, just a little bit. And that's because from about the, say, mid to perhaps early 20th century, coal mining moved to what we call long wall and short wall mining. And basically what that means is that when you take out the coal, you allow the coal seam behind, the void you've created, to collapse. And obviously that then creates what we know as the subsidence at the surface, which we don't like, but it also creates therefore lots of fractured rock above the coal seam. That combined with any open roadways and shafts means that in rocks which are very often not particularly porous or permeable, coal measures tend not to be, not everywhere but in general, certainly in this area they're not particularly porous and permeable. What the coal mining means is it's created zones of permeability. Also there's a possibility that, particularly to the roadways and shafts, you may connect to quite to depth, and therefore you may be able to bring up higher temperatures. If you've got groundwater flow coming up from depth, by exploiting old coal workings, you may be able to get enough water flow at elevated temperatures. There are some disadvantages, of course, main one being contamination mainly through iron and so on, which can then lead to corrosion and scaling, but if you know about it, you can deal with that. That's not necessarily a problem. So just look at the power, the sort of different energies we might be talking about. So a very simple calculation. A Southampton type well might come up with something like 3 megawatts. That's what you might be expecting. That's probably what they were hoping from Science Central when they put it down, to get something like 3 megawatts. A typical open loop ground source heat pump, okay, so where you're exploiting an aquifer, in an area of coal measures, where we wouldn't get a particularly high water flow, typical groundwater temperature, though we might expect something like 63 kilowatts, which through a heat pump with a copper 4, we might get an 84 kilowatt total thermal capacity. With a mine water, with that extra permeability, then hopefully we might get 10 litres per second from a single borehole rather than 3, plus a higher temperature if we're getting a bit of water coming from depth, in which case our energy now goes up to 446 in total, 334 geothermal contribution. So what that really is saying is, and the reason why we might want to exploit mine waters is not that we're going to suddenly get temperatures of 70 or 80 degrees, it's just that we can perhaps get an enhanced open loop type ground source heat. A considerable premium over open loop in an area where it wouldn't have been a possibility. And so this is a map of the coal fields, so just look roughly where they are, because here again is our heating place from the Sherwood sandstone, and again they tend to be in the main mutually exclusive. So the coal fields exploiting former coal fields, particularly in urban areas, is again an opportunity where we don't have the deep saline aquifers. And as an example, here's the Scottish central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh, which has been extensively mined. Very difficult to say exactly what resource might be sat there. So these are some sort of ballpark figures which were actually done for the Scottish Government about 2 years ago. And it says, well, if we could, for a per kilometre squared, so it's not per borehole, it's per kilometre squared, stick several boreholes in and get a combined flow of about 60 litres per second, which is not unreasonable. particularly in a mined area, then potentially there's 12 gigawatt of heat capacity there in that mined area across the whole of the central belt of Scotland. Well, the annual heat demand for Scotland is about 33 to 40 gigawatts. So theoretically, a third of Scotland's heat demand could come from these mine workings. So that's quite a mind-boggling figure. Okay, it's not going to happen as much as that because you need users near the mined areas. You're going to have to do a lot of work on your properties to upgrade them so that you can then use this type of low-grade heat. And of course, not all the mine workings will be suitable. Some of these won't work, some will. But nevertheless, going back to the big numbers we've talked about previously, there is potentially, if it's exploited and developed, a lot of heat potentially available there in our mined areas, particularly in urban areas where there is the heat demand. And so really just to finish off, just to show you that something has been done, not much. Most of what's been done till now is very small single apartment blocks where they've just drilled into one coal seam and then they've managed to produce water to heat those buildings. Very successfully, I might add. People living in those apartment blocks are very pleased with what's happened because they now get very low heating bills indeed. Now, could it be done for district heating? This is a bigger challenge. Now, it has been done here at Heelan in the Netherlands and I think at one site in Canada and Nova Scotia. It's a much bigger challenge because you need a lot more water and ideally you want it as hot as possible. So at Heelan, a former mining area with a new town, they've actually tried to map all of their mine workings and they actually try and pump from depth. So they're actually trying to pump something like 800 metres depth where they will get warmer water. And then they're discharged in shallow workings sort of away from here, sort of over here somewhere. And they have achieved it, but it was quite difficult. And they certainly had more problems than they were expecting. It was a complex process to get to where they are now. But it can be done. And there certainly are some councils in this country who've seen what's happened in Heelan and are interested. But there are some cautionary words here which come from Heelan, and that is you really have got to do quite a lot of work. You need to work out what are your pathways. You need to say, well, if I pump from somewhere, what will the effect be? Is it going to be sustainable? Is that going to go on for 25 years, or in 5 years am I going to be pulling in cold water from my injection borehole or from the surface? You need to know that before you invest the sorts of monies which are needed to develop a scheme like this. And so that's where we are really with some of these bigger mine water schemes. If we're going to develop them, we need to do quite a lot of work to investigate exactly what is going on in the subsurface and then to model what we expect. So I'm going to finish there with a few sort of conclusions. Geothermal indeed does offer the prospect of clean renewable heat. There's a large heat resource and we know in places such as the Cheshire Basin they can go up to 100 degrees C. Within those granites it can go up to 200 degrees C. So the temperatures are down there. And so those locations over those perma-Triassic aquifers, we can tap into that, and in regions away from those, then maybe we can, if we're careful, maybe we can go for fractured rocks and we can extend the applicability of the what we might call the deep saline aquifers, in other words the water for district heating. Power generation from EGS is a tantalising possibility. Maybe we're on the cusp of seeing something happen. It's baseload power. Potentially it's got quite a lot going for it. Let's see what happens in the next couple of years. So mine waters, okay, they offer, let's call it an enhanced open loop ground source heat pump in regions devoid of other deep geothermal. And given how many disused mines we have, it has to be something we need to look at. And so my final point there, which comes from looking at those mine waters and from that science central borehole, is to say this: we need to make sure we try and get the risk down. And I think we need to do more exploration and background work, more desk work, before we commit to the drill. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got about another 10 minutes, so I'd like to open it to the floor. If anyone has any questions that you'd like to put to Jon, then please raise your hand. And
about the Southampton fitting, you said that they've been pumping the water back into the sea rather than into the reservoir. Is there a potential of collapse in that reservoir then?
Not so much collapse. What's happening is if you don't put the water back into where you get it out from, because obviously the water is not to the seam, the aquifer isn't connected all the way to the surface, then basically the reservoir pressure drops. So the water in the well, originally the standing level was about 100 metres depth, I think. So they actually put a pump was a hydraulic pump, to sit about 100 metres down in the well, so it's pumping. But what's happened is the water level in the well, therefore, has dropped. So what they've had to do is replace the pump with another pump, which is therefore going to go deeper. And so ultimately the disadvantage of that is that, you know, the higher the level you have to raise the water, in other words, the deeper the pump is, the more power you have to use. Eventually to the point where it won't be worth doing. So that is why, in general, even though it costs money, you would put a second borehole in to put the water back, so you keep up the pressure. And also for environmental reasons, they could only do it because they were by the sea. Those waters are very saline. If you were not in a coastal location, you couldn't dispose of it to surface water. You'd have to either clean it up and then put it into probably a water treatment works, or you're going to have to put it back down a second borehole.
Do you use the same energy to pump the water up as in same geothermal energy?
You could if you were doing an EGS system, and I imagine they probably do. Obviously, if you're just doing the hot water ones, you're not producing power, so you'd have to obviously use grid power for that. Yeah. But what they do for the EGS ones, obviously they call that parasitic power, where they actually have to use some of the power to run the system. And so you do need to just make sure you distinguish when people quote figures at you, whether it's gross power or net power, because they can be quite different. You know, that example I showed from salts, where they were only producing 1 megawatt, that's 1 megawatt net. They were using a lot of power to pump the water down and pump it back up again, which is why they're only getting 1 megawatt.
So I guess there are two ways that you're doing this. You're either taking the hot water out that's already down there, or putting more water in and that's coming up. How long does it take for the rock to sort of lose its heat? Because I guess if you're taking more heat out of the rocks than is coming up from the core, then it cools down and you've no longer got it. So is there a lifetime on it?
For the EGS systems going into the granites, given the volume of rock that they are fracturing, and therefore the pathways through it, people have modelled it, and basically they think that one of those systems will have about a 25-year lifetime. So you'd run it for 25 years, then hopefully you then leave it, so start another EGS system maybe next to it, or even beneath it, or above it, and then maybe 25 years, if the heat's recovered in that one, come back to it. So the idea is that over a long time scale, they are sustainable. It's not been proved, I might add, because they've been doing it for long enough yet, but that's sort of what the modelling has indicated. In the case of these saline aquifers where you're pulling in water, then hopefully if you're pulling in water, you could be pulling it in from a long way. So that's a vast amount of hot water that you're dealing with. You're not having to wait for the rocks to cool down because it's coming from the water. So if you've got the water flowing from distance, then there's no reason why that can't go on for a long time. And the Southampton scheme, in fact, is a good example of where that hasn't cooled down at all. So that's been going for 25 years and there's yet to see no temperature drop. So that's not always guaranteed, but again, if you do enough advanced modelling work so you've got an idea of when you start to pump where's the water going to come from, then potentially some of those schemes could have a very long lifetime.
So you have talked about the political challenges that geothermal energy is facing. What are the biggest scientific challenges? The exploration?
I think partly the exploration partly to put the investment into the exploration. I think we know the things we can do to reduce the risk. It won't always work, but we know what we should be doing. So it's a question of cost, I suppose, there. The big scientific challenge is probably drilling, because drilling is always risky going into geology. Things go wrong, and if things go wrong when you've got down 2 or 3 kilometres and you, what we say, lose the well, then that's bad news. It's particularly in geothermal, because there's not much money in it. It's make or break for a company quite often. You get a failed well, that's probably the end of a company. Oil and gas, where all the experience is of drilling wells, because oil and gas is obviously worth a lot of money, they, by definition, have all that built in. They know they're going to have, whatever it is, a 50% failure rate, but it's built into their exploration plans, whereas geothermal doesn't have that. So if you said, where can we make scientific advances, it would probably be drilling, because that, if you could make it more certain, make it cheaper, then that would have a big influence.
I was just wondering, sort of, on what time scale would a system kind of pay for itself? Like, for example, the Southampton one, it was funded by the government initially, is it?
Yeah, I mean the Southampton one would have obviously was a no-brainer because, as you say, the well was put down as part of an exploration program by the government, so it didn't cost them anything at all. So they couldn't go wrong there really. A modern one, I'm not sure. I have to admit, it's going to depend probably where the finance comes from and what sort of interest rates you're having to pay, and or what investors, what return have they been guaranteed. I bet it's quite a complex process to actually come up with the. At what point does people start to make money? Presumably they do. Otherwise, nobody would invest in it. Over the lifetime of the project, I think 25 years, clearly there is a rate of return which is factored in that it will repay the investment, presumably quite generously. But I'm afraid I don't know it will vary from project to project. And
with the recent interest in shale gas in the UK, do you think that'll have a positive impact on development of geothermal?
I don't know. That horrible word fracking, of course, comes up, which isn't a problem really, but nevertheless everyone sees it as a problem. And fracking has been done in geothermal for a long time, as it's been done in oil and gas for a long time, but people weren't aware of it. And so there is now a public awareness program that would have to be done for, let's say, the EGS type projects, which they would have to do. They're aware of it, and it has been done in Cornwall already. But there's always a problem with fracking at the moment. Maybe once we get some shale gas in and it's successful and people start to think, well, it wasn't the threat that everyone's been saying it is, then it could have a positive effect. But at the moment, I think it's possibly a bit the other way, that it could have a negative effect.
Just wondering, because they have to do a lot of 3D modelling and geology, whether that would possibly yield some results in, say, fracture formations which could be useful.
Yeah, well, possibly. I mean, any information you can get on the deep subsurface is useful. I mean, all the information we have on those slides came from hydrocarbon wells, not from geothermal wells. And so hopefully information will come out from shale drilling. Yeah, and but obviously it's probably not going to be in the formations we want. By definition, shale is a tight formation. So there's unlikely to be many geothermal prospects in shale. Not impossible. People have talked about, could we use an old shale well for geothermal? I'm not sure.
Just a comment you made at the very beginning of the presentation. Why in the UK, where the geology is probably most studied on the Earth, don't we know the thickness of the Earth's crust?
Well, onshore, it's because we haven't done the experiments you need. You probably need deep seismic, and the deep seismic was done offshore with the Big Birch program back in the 70s, 80s. So we know around, sort of almost all round, we've got some ideas. But onshore, there's been virtually nothing that was done. So we can extrapolate from the offshore onto onshore. But when we've looked at some of the other data sets, things like the gravity data, it doesn't fit very well with the models that you come up with. So people have speculated, there is in theory, a MOHO depth map available from a publication, which actually came from BGS, but how good it is, I'm not sure.
Would BGS want to do that well, presumably any geologist can want to have that as a project to do.
Yeah.
Would that be useful?
I think it's difficult. It would be difficult to justify to say, well, if we do that, we'll know everything about geothermal or whatever, or we know everything about heat production in the crust. I think it would be a very interesting academic exercise, and we could learn a lot because there'd be all sorts of offshoots in terms of learning about the history of the crust at the same time. I think it's very unlikely to happen. The cost of doing those sort of very deep seismic experiments onshore would be phenomenal.
So at the beginning you were talking about the developments in parts of Germany and France, and you showed me about the UK, obviously France and Germany being bigger countries and more knowledge. Is there more locations in France and Germany that could be exploited for geothermal energy, or is it just a case of investment and sort of financial implications that are different, so much more they ought to extend so much better over there than here?
Well, I mean, if you look at the heat flow map for Germany, and they do have one area known as the Rhine-Graben, which is better than probably what we've got because there's actually thinner crust just there, just so happens. And that is where most of those EGS projects are, because they can get those sorts of temperatures at about 3.5 kilometres, whereas here we're looking more like 4 to 5. Overall, when it comes to sedimentary aquifers, they're probably similar to us. They've probably got opportunities just as we have. Some will coincide with population areas, some won't. One of the advantages that Germany did have going back is that because they had coalition governments right through probably the 90s and into the early 2000s, the Green Party had quite an influence, and there was actually, I think, effectively a carbon tax going way back, or certainly a fossil fuel tax. And so the agreement was that money would be used for renewable energy research. So they were able to do a lot of work, a lot of background work during that period. When we were bashing away putting gas in, they were doing research into both wind, solar and geothermal. So I think that's one of the reasons why they're ahead of us. Yeah.
Well, if that's all of the questions, I'll bring it to a close. If we can again thank you, Jon, for coming and giving us a talk on geothermal. Thank you, Jon. If you'd like to put your hands together for Jon. Thank you very much.